Thank you, thank you.
Good to go. So I'll be back to open the doors and I'll come up and sit down.
Awesome, thank you. All right, good morning, everybody. Appreciate you joining us on a Thursday morning here. So just a little bit more background about myself, give you a little bit idea of my experience. So I was 10 years in the Air Force, active duty. I was stationed out here at Pacific Air Forces and was the operations chief of the Network Operations Security Center for a number of years. And then I separated from service, actually joined a small local integrator here, and then we worked a lot on audiovisual systems, unified capabilities. And then after several years of doing that, I decided to step out on my own and focus really on the project management, technical project management, as well as the consulting piece. So that's kind of my background. The one note I wanted to say is during my military time, I really took lead from some of the senior civilians that I worked with who were great role models for me. And really, they made it their job to take time, during their lunch hours, during any free time they had, and actually they continually went through the regulations and rules to just get spun up on what's happening, what's evolving. And that really kind of instilled in me, the need to understand how technology is evolving, how the rules and regulations are keeping up with those. And that's really what I found as a junior officer was, you're stuck in the service, so you're focused on service-related regulations. You don't really look outside of that umbrella. But when you start talking about audiovisual systems, you start talking about some of these other information systems, it's incredibly important to look outside the box and understand the different aspects of security in an operations center. And that's really what I focused this presentation around. So to set some expectations here, we're going to touch very briefly on the computer network security, unique challenges in an operations center, some security considerations and design considerations when talking about audiovisual systems. And we're going to touch briefly on video teleconferencing because especially nowadays in the multi-domain environment where you're dealing with multiple classifications, you really need to pay attention to different aspects of the VTC world. Then we'll just go through a quick summary. Just my disclaimer here, presentation is really information only. I'm not the foremost expert, but this is everything that I've consolidated over a number of years of experience. Okay, so ultimately, the solution, the underlying products, the rules and regulations that are required in your particular operations center, should you be working in one, really goes to the designated approval authority as well as your special security officer, the SSO. So from an information systems endpoint strategy, you really have these standard aspects that you're looking at, right? You're looking at standardized images, you're looking at automated patches, you want to encrypt your data, you want to encrypt it at rest, in motion, you want to have an enterprise-grade endpoint security system set up, you're separating your standard privilege user access, and you have a strong AAA authentication solution in your environment. And for the DoD in particular, they've taken it one step further where they've used PKI and they've actually tied that with DEERS, so that helps with the authentication aspect for DoD systems. Nowadays, they're rolling out the two-factor authentication. That's really a mitigation factor against weak passwords or reused passwords because there's no way to audit an individual user's password, whether or not they're using it across multiple systems inside and outside the DoD network. So two-factor authentication is really mitigation factor against that. And then training. Everything is underscored with user training. And just a sidebar here, if you have any questions or comments, please, it should be really a dialogue. Okay. And with information security endpoint protection and pushing patches, invariably you run into these issues. We've all been there, but security is important. So, okay. Now, with all of that, the DoD has also been able to orchestrate, a beautiful architecture here of defense in depth, where you're talking about your internet, your gateways, the different sensors at the gateway level, your backbone, so GigBE, your regional enclave perimeter. So it's just a number of sensors and firewalls and routers and ACLs, all the way down to the user level where you actually have end user connectivity. In addition to that, I've created the programmatic functions. So US Cyber Command used to be JTF-GNO. Now we have the mechanisms to maintain all of these infrastructures, right, from a policy, procedure, technology standpoint. So let's get into a little bit of the operations centers because we're going to talk more detail about these here. So the main challenges for an operations center is really to enable visibility and collaboration amongst various people, right? Operations center can be 10, 20, 50, 100 people, even more in some aspects. It's a high apps tempo. Usually you've got multiple things going on in an operations center. You're trying to really shorten that observe, orient, decide, and act loop, the OODA loop, to make sure you make decisions very quickly for the commander. You're dealing with multiple classifications, so multi-domain environment. You can have anything from, you got your standard NIPR and SIPR, your coalition networks, your JWICs, your top secret networks, and anything above and beyond that. And you have your many coalition partners that you're working with inside those environments. Biggest challenge here is you have the technology that's evolving very quickly, but you have a slow procurement process, right? So you have to plan for these things out. And the main emphasis here is, with that in mind, you have to build security in from the ground up. You can't assume that you're going to install a system and then later on you're going to find budget and the procurement process to actually go through and install security after that's installed. So you need to start from the ground up on that piece. And then you're dealing with personnel churn. You have the military rotations, you've got coalition partners in and out as they do their rotations. So you always have a training aspect there as well. So what's the training for working inside the operations center as well as the security aspects for the operations center? And then you're dealing with your insider threat. And we're all familiar with the insider threat these days and your emerging threats. Any questions up, sir?
Well, actually, I do have another point.
Mm-hmm.
Real estate problem in the op center. It is, in headquarters, here comes an inside system, and we have Section K, Section J,
Mm-hmm.
and JWIC. So now we have an issue about consolidation of the system. Well, not exactly consolidation, but probably multiple systems, single display. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, in the typical operations center, of days gone by, you have multiple boxes sitting by the operator's feet, the analyst's feet. And it takes up a lot of real estate. It takes up, it generates a lot of heat. You have component failures. Then you have to deploy your IT team in there to actually pull that asset out, so it impacts the analyst at that time. You don't really have a readily available failover process. And you have to maintain your Tempest separation of the different classifications. So it's all very challenging to deal with. And so we'll get into that. That's a good point. So here's your typical operations center design. You have your central router in the middle, so your router frame, and this is just purely from an audiovisual standpoint, and a KVM standpoint, so keyboard, video, mouse, right, which is one of the solutions for having multiple desktops at your feet. So you have all of your computer sources here, so just straight rack mount PCs off the operations floor. And then you have your analyst positions here with your desktop destinations. They can have 1, 2, 3, even 4 monitors, maybe more, on their desktop. You have your CAC reader for access, keyboard, mouse. And then you have systems like your video walls, and your situational awareness walls. So you can have multi-walls, you can have different walls in different rooms. You can actually have multiple rooms next to each other that combined form the operations center, so you need to share information between those rooms. There's a number of different scenarios. And then to control it all, you have this guy right here. This is the control system that connects to all of these components to make sure that it's switching correctly and routing the video where you want it to go at the right time. We'll get into this a little bit more, but this is one of the vulnerabilities of a typical operations center design, is the security of that control system. Any questions about it? Yes, sir?
I like that design. Do you have a plan, a proposal for that kind of design?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a number of vendors. I actually work with a company called Think Logical, if you're familiar with them. So they do these KVM type solutions.
And that go with JWICs?
goes with JWICs.
JWICs with that?
Absolutely. So, and we'll get into more of the certification piece to go through that. Any other questions about this design here? Now, the one thing I did want to say is, later on we'll talk about, a matrix switch type environment where you're simply routing video to different endpoints here, video walls, versus a cross-domain solution. And I would propose to the audience here that with technology evolving the way it is, we're hooking up more and more devices as destinations that can actually encode and transmit data outside of the operations center. So in essence, you're creating a cross-domain solution. You really need to pay attention to what's being done with that data as it's leaving the environment, and that you limit and mitigate the aspects of spillages from different classifications over. So that's one consideration we'll cover up here. Okay, so audiovisual systems are often overlooked as an information system. And then we have an increasingly complex environment, the matrix switch versus a cross-domain solution, as I just said. So there's various rule sets to consider here. Who's familiar with Tempest certifications? Everyone, I hope. All right, we'll get into more of that. And then you have the common criteria evaluation. You have the DoD Unified Capabilities Requirements, which is tied to the JITC APL, the Approved Products List. And then you have your service and agency specific guidance. So there's a number of layers of rules and regulations you need to follow when you're considering a design scenario for an operations center. So who knows what Vinick freaking is? Anyone? Okay. So 1985, a researcher by the name Wim Vinick published a paper, and it was entitled The Electromagnetic Radiation from Video Display Units and Eavesdropping Risk. And what he was able to do is actually use channel information, the channel state information, from a CRT monitor, and from a distance up to 20 meters away, and an antenna array was able to eavesdrop on what was being displayed on that CRT display and replicate it. So he was snooping on that. And this is the whole basis of Tempest certification. Okay? Now it's evolved quite a bit. 2004, Marcus G. Kuhn extended this to LCDs. So LCDs are also at risk. It's not just CRTs. 2014, Mordechi Guri demonstrated Airhopper. Anyone familiar with Airhopper? So Airhopper, the principle of this was, and hopefully my video links, is they were looking at operations centers in particular in the air gap solution. So as you walk into a secure environment, you have the little cubby holes where you can put your cell phones, and that's considered a secure practice. Well, they challenged that with this program and this methodology called Airhopper, where they're actually able to, on a mobile phone, receive and eavesdrop in RF emanations and actually skim information off of the displays and passwords being typed on keyboards. So let's see if I can pull this up here. There's no sound, you just have to, about a minute long. That's not playing on there, hold on. So what they're showing here is this is an air-gapped computer. They're going to bring up the web browser, and they're going to show that there's no internet connection enabled on this, so there's no network interfaces enabled. So I'm going to move over to the mobile device they have. They're going to type on this screen, but they're going to briefly show the mobile device that they have where they actually develop the software to intercept these RF emanations coming from this air-gapped computer. This looks like a standard phone. And again, no network, no SIM, no Wi-Fi, so no network connection. Okay, so their app is started, and they're going to type a message on the screen. I don't know if you can see it in the way back, but it's actually appearing here as well. So here's the trippy thing. This guy was in the next room, and he got the same message. So unfortunately for us, Tempest is often overlooked as far as a security consideration, but it's very real. It's a very real threat.
I got a question about that.
Sure.
I look at the command I'm at. We have phone boxes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a security door where you badge in, and there's a turnstile where you badge in again. Between those two is a phone box. People, it's their choice whether they leave the phone on or off.
Right.
And then just past that inner turnstile, there's a corridor, but then on either side there's systems, like Cipher.
Mm-hmm.
One Cipher and then some other systems. So I guess what I'm wondering is, to what extent is the penetration to which a phone, using Airhopper, picks up data?
So it really depends on the building construction type, right? If it's concrete, how thick the walls are, rebar, those types of things. But this type of attack has been done up to 100 meters away. So.
Location that he's talking about is not concrete wall.
So.
It's in both.
And that's where there's actually supposed to be individuals that are certified, Tempest accreditors to actually inspect for this type of thing. But they're very few and far between. There's actually, I didn't link it here, but there's a GAO report about Tempest and how it's not, and it was written back in, at the time, 86, I think it was. And it was talking about Tempest certification back then and how it was very difficult to enforce because not a lot of people understood it. So, and this is,
So I thought Tempest requirements for foreign base.
not necessarily. I mean, you have your Tempest requirements, so even when you have your 1 meter separation, that's part of the Tempest requirements, right? You have 1 meter separation between high and low.
Red-black separation.
Right.
But I guess I'm looking at the Tempest requirement supposedly was aimed at, we have bases in Japan, so like 20 feet away from the parameter, and you do a Tempest sweep,
Mm-hmm.
right? So is that in that category, or is it a different category you're talking about Tempest?
So it'd be a different category. I actually have a Tempest slide coming up here, so we can talk about that and the different, because there's 3 different categories as far as the SDIP 27 goes. The other piece here, and I'll just bring up this last one. So 2016, this was released 6 days ago. So if you haven't seen it in the news yet, you'll probably see it hit the wire pretty shortly. So Shanghai University researcher, Mengwan Li and his team actually was able to demonstrate on a mobile device. Okay, so let me pull up my phone here. The video is about 26 minutes long if you want to look it up on YouTube. But as my hand goes over my mobile device to actually enter my PIN code, my hand is altering the Wi-Fi signals of my phone. And with 68% accuracy, they were able to use their application WindTalker and basically infer what my PIN code is just by the movement of my hand and how the Wi-Fi signal is being disturbed. So pretty interesting to watch. So if you don't think the threat's out there, it is, and they're very capable. So the attack vectors are evolving as fast as the new technology, and that's why it's really incumbent on security designs to stay on top of what the emerging threats are and what the possibilities are out there and try to predict and react to those. Okay, so emissions security, the Tempest piece, right? So you have the NSA specification as well as a NATO certification. So that's where the overseas portion comes in. And it basically refers to the spying of information systems through leaked emanations, including the unintentional radio and electrical signals. And so there's 3 levels, right? You have level A, which is a 1 meter away, and this is what you're talking about, the free space. So this is talking about your Tempest sweeps, and this is free space distance. So 1 meter away, if it's a level A certification, 20 meters or 100 meters. And that's depending on the sensitivity of the environment of the building that you're trying to protect. Okay. But this also applies to individual components, equipment, right? So you can buy products out there that are Tempest certified products. And that's an important consideration when you talk about developing and integrating all these different products into an operations center, is you have to pay attention to what those separation requirements are, what devices can actually be truly multi-domain and be certified to handle connections to all kinds of different networks and classifications at the same time. Okay. And then actually, if you look in the VTC STIG, and we'll touch on this at the end, but there's actually a finding here where you need to maintain your red-black separation of devices and cabling, right? So if you're installing a red-black type system in the VTC world, you need to keep all your cabling separate, right? And so they have 2 different standards. You have the 1 meter separation, or you have the 15 centimeter separation. So it depends on what your SSO is determining for your environment. But you have to maintain your cable separation, your device separation, and that's an important consideration because there are a lot of designs out there, which I've come across, where cables are run in parallel with each other, and copper cable will run in parallel with each other. It's essentially an antenna. So you have the cabling run together, you have the components put together, really not compliant with this type of requirement. Any questions, sir?
So, what's your opinion on copper and fiber cable running parallel together, carrying 2 separate classifications? They don't cross talk.
No, they wouldn't cross talk because you're using optical for one of them.
So does that meet that requirement, or does it void the requirement?
That would be an interpretation by your SSO or your DAA for accepting that system. Okay. And it's usually determined on, what's the level of risk that they're willing to accept in their environment. Okay, so when we're talking about Tempest, if you look at a typical video distribution switch, almost all the switches on the market right now are OEO devices. So that's an optical, and then it actually goes to an electronic fabric inside the switch, and that's how it's able to route to a different port or broadcast across multi. So that's how you have the one-to-many broadcast, and then it converts back to optical. And that electronic fabric is really what determines the bandwidth of the switch, how much throughput you can have, what the resolution it's supported, and that's the heavy-duty electronics. But that's also where you run some risk. If you're using a non-Tempest certified device and you're running multiple classifications through it, are you compliant with that? In most cases, you'd have to say no. But most people don't understand how these matrix switches work and how they operate. There are actually photonic switchers out there that are incredibly expensive and they're incredibly slow to switch, and that's why they're not readily used in operation centers. Is because it takes time to align the mirrors in one of those switches to change from source to source, and that delay has been unacceptable in the past. So that's why the default has always been the OEO type switch. You just need to be on the lookout for those that are actually certified for Tempest requirements if you are running multiple classifications through it. Any questions about this? Tracking pretty good. Okay, so common criteria. Who's familiar with common criteria? A little bit? Okay, so you have, the way it's really structured is common criteria is an international organization, international certifications. So in the US, we have the NIAP, the National Information Assurance Partnership. It's a partnership between the NSA and NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And NIAP actually uses, a little bit history here, NIAP used to use the EAL type certifications, just like everybody else in the coalition. A few years ago, they moved to what's called protection profiles. So they actually have clearly defined protection profiles for different types of devices. And when that change happened, there was a lot of concern within the industry because a lot of devices that were previously NIAP approved with the EAL structure were no longer approved. And so what ended up happening was NIAP actually went through and NSA clarified this guidance. If there's a protection profile available, then NIAP will certify the device. If there is no protection profile available, they'll actually accept, through the reciprocity agreements, the common criteria evaluation criteria still. So you'll see a number of manufacturers like the Market Central Switch, which is a central component in a multi-domain VTC suite. It's actually certified in Canada. It's EAL4 certified by the Canadian authorities. NIAP accepts that accreditation, through the reciprocity agreements. It's the same with that ThinkLogical switch that I was showing you, that large frame. That's an EAL4 certified device. It's certified in Norway. But the US recognizes it because NIAP recognizes EAL type certifications. And so common criteria is the long name, Common Criteria for Information Technology Security Evaluation, and it is an international certification. The NIAP actually feeds into the common criteria and shares the protection profiles and the products that it's evaluated, and receives the certifications and accepts the certifications of devices from other foreign companies or countries. So you see here, you have certificate authorizing members, you have a number of these, and then you have the certificate consuming members. So these guys actually leverage the certifications provided, and these guys actually do a lot of the evaluations on a number of products. So if you ever go out to the Common Criteria portal and just do a search, you'll see thousands of products out there that are actually certified at one level or another. For a KVM solution, just a side note, EAL4 is the highest assurance level that's recognized globally for a KVM type product. And these are the different EAL type certifications. So essentially, when you go to a common criteria and you look at the EAL, it's more of a quality assurance type check, quality assurance type certification, that this device is going to function as it's supposed to, 9 times out of 10, whatever their criteria is, according to the different EAL levels. And that's why a number of governments, financial institutions, critical industries like oil and gas, a lot of the solutions that they use in their environments are EAL certified at one level or another, because they rely on that certification to know that they're buying a quality product and know that that product is going to function as it's supposed to. I mean, imagine if you have a matrix switcher and you're routing a top secret feed into a VTC source. You need the assurance that that feed is going to the right destination on that VTC, because that's being transmitted to the distant end. If that switch were to malfunction and accidentally routed over a nipper, all of a sudden you have a spillage. So that's where the EAL certifications come in. Any questions about this? Okay. The UCR. Okay. Everyone's familiar with the UCR, I'm sure, with the JITC. Okay, so it's the technical requirements for certifications approved to be used in DoD networks and provide end-to-end unified capabilities. It's really all about interoperability. So the UCR defines the functional requirements, the performance objectives, and the technical specifications for products to be used in the DoD environment. And that's what you find on the JITC APL when you go out and look on the website there. The challenge is security, although a consideration in the JITC testing for the APL, is really not a focus of it. They're really focused on the standards and protocols and interoperability with the different product set that's being used in the DoD environment. And that's really a misnomer. If you go to a number of end users that I've talked to, they view JITC APL as the end-all be-all, and that's it. If it's JITC APL, they can use it anywhere they want. And that's not necessarily the case. In fact, in the UCR, you can find this under the VDS, the video distribution section, where it specifically says that the video distribution system shall comply with the NIST NIAP standards. And so again, it ties back to what type of environment are you operating in? What type of device do you need to purchase? What assurance level do you need to operate that product successfully in your environment? And then, of course, you have the DISA-STIGs. And if you haven't seen, I know back when I was dealing with the DISA-STIGs, they were all PDF documents. and they were very interesting to use. But nowadays, you actually have the disassisted viewer. So this is just the video services and video teleconferencing STIGs, and I have it filtered on one. But you can see there's a number of checks and balances here as far as number of findings and different things that you have to account for when you start looking at implementing a secure VTC system. And a lot of those touch on NIAP approved, Tempest certifications, cross-domain, multi-domain type solutions, whether or not you have a certified AB switch. So data security. So you can have all the technology in the world, but you still have to deal with your users. That's one of the main threats we're dealing with these days in the operations center type environment. You have your defense in depth architecture, you have a number of sensors, you have a number of products from a ton of different qualified vendors that are out here on the floor, with different type of security mechanisms, whether it's proactive or reactive, logging, analysis. There's a lot of solutions out there for network type, but none of them really deal with the user. And that's really the challenge, is you have to deal with the user either through training or through the design aspects that you consider in your operations center. So interesting read. If you ever have time, you can go over to the CNSS website and pull up this InfoSec 1-99. It's all about the insider threat. Published in 1999, the findings are still true. It's all about, they actually surveyed 520 agencies, corporations, financial institutions, and they determined that 36% actually experienced losses due to insider threat. And just a report earlier this year by Accenture and HFS Research, of 208 security professionals, they reported 69% attempt theft or corruption of data this year, in the last 12 months. So here's the nature of the insider threat. You have your attackers, and they're trusted. They're inside your environment. They have access. They already have a username, password, login, and they're cleared. The motivations, it's motivations, 4 categories from this publication, the InfoSec 1-99. So you have your trader, your zealot, your browser, and your well-intentioned, right? And so the way they classify these, you have one that's just in it for personal gain. You have one has a staunch stance against something that you're doing in your environment. You have someone who's just curious. And then you have the whistleblower types, right? So let's get into a little bit of the secure design criteria for an operations center. So really when you consider it, there's 5 different criteria that need to be considered in a secure operations center. And that's that the system architecture should physically secure and separate the target of attack, which is your computers, from the threat, which is your people. So you need that physical separation. The second one is you need to deal with the eavesdropping aspect. So you want to make sure that the system should eliminate the ability to attack the system, that is, sniff or eavesdrop on the system. The third one, it should allow the administrator to closely manage and control access in accordance with the organization's security policies. So that's all your security controls. The fourth would be the automatically and continuously monitor for the identity and identify breaches. And the fifth would be the system should be resilient, right? So it should be designed not only to withstand an attack, but to recover from one. Any questions about these criteria? Pretty straightforward. So here's the typical operations center. You'll have your user sitting by his desk, surrounded by a number of PCs and monitors. What you want to do is actually take all of these PCs, move them off to a secure location, into a data center, into an adjacent room, whatever you can do to physically secure those assets. And then once you have this separation, you actually have a much more efficient workspace area, so it's much cleaned up. So not only do you have the benefits of reduce power consumption, reduce heating, but you also are more secure in that environment. Once you've achieved that physical separation, you can actually restrict access to USB 3, USB 2, the network ports, and then you only allow the essential human interfaces. So everybody's familiar with the difference between USB HID versus USB 2.0, correct? So HID, the human interface, is essentially your keyboard, mouse, your joysticks. You can't really transmit data or exfiltrate data off of those ports. It's only for peripherals. Okay. And then all your user authentication mechanisms are maintained, whether it's biometrics, username, password, PKI, two-factor authentication. You can still leverage all of that same technology. You're just separating the user from the actual target, which would be the computer. Question?
I guess that's a very good environment. How do you deal with the data input and data backup issue?
So on that.
You have no access to, when you move the machine into an area, I'm looking at the after picture, right?
Mhm.
So now what if I need to back up the data? What I need to burn a CD, a DVD? So how would you address that?
So and there are solutions out there where you can actually allow, per the system administrator's guidance, right, you can allow access to certain USB devices or USB ports. Sure.
I have another idea. Once you virtualize the entire solution, and it takes away from the need for backup, it's virtualized.
Mhm.
No, I understand, but then you also need to have, you need to extract data of certain, when
That's
you
what
work.
you're saying. If you put that in the system administrator's pocket, that they'll take care of that. Because everything is behind the data center, it's not on the desktop.
So,
It's all back there.
right, so
If you
basically what
replicate
you say
data,
is
it's very
submit a job for them to
Yeah, just
export.
simply a ticket.
Correct?
Yeah. But that's what we do today.
So if I want a DVD made, I will submit a ticket, have it made with DVD, and show what file I need.
Mhm. It really goes back to what works in your environment, right? You have the KVM type solution where you have the operator console and you have all your assets off to the side. You have your VDI environment, which you could still, in that environment, use a KVM solution as well, because you need to access multiple classifications, seamlessly.
We like it because, for one, backup is irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's virtualized. Basically, if something breaks, you just replicate it and boom, we're back to business. There's no downtime at all.
Yeah, you have a standard template you deploy for your
And
PC.
depending on cost.
Yeah, no, it's a very valid point. Any other questions about this? Okay, and when you have that physical separation, if you leverage the use of optical fibers, you can prevent the eavesdropping aspect as well, right? Or you severely minimize that. You still have some considerations, power supplies and keyboards and everything else, but you drastically minimize the availability of information to eavesdrop in. And that's what we're talking about with the USB, limiting the USB devices. So you can manage and control access. You limit the user's ability to copy or inject malware devices, flash drives, other portable or concealable materials. You restrict the USB ports wherever possible. And then you can basically limit to the HID function. So you have the capability of enabling it for certain positions and disabling it for everybody else. The other aspect would be you enable users to access only those parts of the systems that they're authorized. And this is where you get into the concept of system partitioning and restricted routing. And so I've got a couple diagrams to really talk through this piece here. So partitioning, imagine you have a large frame, where you have 320 inputs, 320 outputs. That's a lot of I/O that you can route through that matrix switch. What we can do is actually partition it off. So you're basically saying for your outputs, output 1 through 5, for instance, or 1 through 4, can only map to inputs 1 through 4. And so you actually are creating a virtual switch as part of your larger frame. So you can partition off. And then that way you can actually have black networks and red networks and yellow networks all separate from each other. So they don't even touch each other. But it's still on one common device where you can actually easily maintain spares, spare power supplies, spare cards, monitor the system, through a single monitoring system. So that's one way to do it. The other way would be restricted routing. And what restricted routing does is you can actually see, this is actually the sources, so these are the computers off in your data center, and these are the user stations, right, the analyst stations. So being priority 1 here, this red station has access to all of these different sources. So they can pull information from all of these sources. Contrary to that, the black station down here only has access to the black computer. So you can set up your restricted routing in a method where certain positions only have access to certain resources. And to effectively do this and make sure that you're not at risk for a control system, your controller system being compromised and overriding this, I know at least on one product that this is actually embedded in the firmware. So you set up the switch once, embed it in the firmware, and that way whatever input is received from the control system, it will not override whatever's programmed in the firmware. So, and then you can also restore different images to that switch to be able to change this depending on the scenario in the operations center. Any questions about partitioning, restricted routing, the differences, and the capabilities? Okay. All right, security monitoring. So this is, the age-old SNMP. So your simple network management protocol. So you can set up monitoring systems, SNMP traps to make sure, on all the components that are connected to an audiovisual system, monitor what's happening in those. If an account is being logged into when it shouldn't be logged into, if it's malfunctioning, you can quickly identify those. And then resiliency. So the ability to recover should a breach occur. So that's at the component level, so your cards, your power supplies, the different modules, and then the automatic failover. So depending on the criticality of the systems in your operations center, you can actually set up a parallel system with a heartbeat between, so you have a high availability audiovisual system. So in case one component should fail, it automatically fails over to the other one. All right, any questions before we get into the VTC part? That's really the audiovisual, sir.
You talked about the JIT and how security's not the focus.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things that we run into is we have that JIT-approved devices. They buy the stick. Certain things can't be applied in that device for the state requirements. So we're kind of stuck in the catch-22. It's like, oh, that's going to be in the next version. The next version is not JIT-approved yet.
Right.
So we're like, do we use it, keep on using it, or pulling this thing out? Or because it's not like how you said that they look at the stick when they're doing the JIT approval. So we got a lot of those findings that just have to stay open.
Mm-hmm.
Just when you encountered that, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely have encountered that. Most of the time, because it's after the procurement cycle happens, that's where you have your POAM and say, okay, this is how we're going to mitigate it. Now, if it's a Cat 1 finding, then you have to find a way to mitigate that really well. Yeah, and the other aspect too is, and we'll get into a little bit in the VTC side, part of the STIG requirements is to continually update patches, right, on these systems. And in terms of audiovisual systems, because all these components have different APIs, you're integrating them all, and it's working via software integration. If you upgrade one component, chances are you're going to affect another component, and you need to upgrade. So if you're going to upgrade the firmware on your VTC codec, you're going to upgrade the software that's actually controlling that codec, because more than likely the software commands are going to change, and that's been historical, right? So you kind of have to plan out for those expenses as well. It's always been, historically, it's always been a very challenging environment to deal with in that regard. And that's where I say you really have to pay attention to the details, when you're actually in the procurement method, to understand what the requirements are, so you actually get your requirements written down, and then you find the solution. Any other questions about that? Okay, VTCs. So as I'd mentioned earlier, the VTC aspect is critically important because, in my opinion, it changes your audiovisual system in an operations center from a simple matrix routing system to a low-level cross-domain type solution, because ultimately you're able to push, different classifications across that switch potentially into a VTC, which is now encoding it and transmitting it to the distant end. So you have to make sure that you're on the correct classification end to end. So what happens here is, VTC it's always been an important tool, and the codecs themselves are also, a prime target for eavesdropping, right? So if you can compromise a VTC codec, you get access to a beautiful camera that usually has a view of everything going on in your environment, some high-power microphones that can eavesdrop easily in the environment as well. So that's why you need to protect these assets. So the types of VTC suites that we typically come across here, you have the single domain. So usually you have one codec, one domain, very simple system, really not too much of a threat there, just besides maintaining your patch level and make sure that codec's not compromised to eavesdrop. But then you have the switched multi-codec type solution. So you actually have a video matrix switch with multiple codecs connected to it, and that's perfectly allowable, via DISA-STIG requirements. The caveat to that is you need to make sure that each of those codecs that are not in use are powered off. So the control system needs to physically switch off the power of each of those codecs that are not in use in order to be compliant. And then you also have the switch single codec. So these are your multi-domain type suites, your multi-domain video network switches. So you have a single codec, and you have a type of periods processing device connected to that codec, which is able to go through the periods processing process and essentially sanitize the codec, switch it to the new network, load the new configuration, and then you're up and operational. And when its system is turned off, it flushes all the settings, returns it back to factory default, and turns off the codec. That's the periods processing. And I'll bring up the periods processing guide in a minute here, because that's an often overlooked piece. All components of both of those two switch systems are controlled by a single control system. So in essence, you have an AMX, a Crestron, an Extron control system that's connected to each component in that design and is controlling those components. So if you were to compromise that control system, now you have access to codecs potentially that are sitting on different classifications. So you need to pay attention to how those systems are designed. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the last one, you don't see it too often these days, but you have the centralized codec farm where you have a large matrix switch. You've got VTC codecs operational on all the time, and then they're basically doing different classification VTCs through that same switch, simultaneously. And so the controls that are needed for that, that's where your restricted routing or your partitioning comes into play to make sure that you don't inadvertently switch a higher classification feed to a lower classification destination and have a spillage. So the types of control system vulnerabilities here, these aren't too far-fetched. As you can see in the corner here, I pulled this off of Pony Express. You familiar with the Pony Express company? So out of the East Coast, they sell a whole bunch of different hacking tools open on the net. They're a bunch of vulnerability researchers. And this particular device here is an RS-232 sniffer, essentially. So you can connect it in line with your RS-232 connections, which is how your control system typically interfaces with your codec and your other components. And then over a Wi-Fi transmission, it'll transmit whatever data is going over that feed. So for RS-232, generally it's unencrypted in these types of design systems. And you're passing all kinds of control information, codec configuration information, maybe even plain text username, passwords to log into the codec. Who knows? So that's one way to compromise. The other ones are, you have an IP-based system. So nowadays you'll see a lot of the control systems that are IP-based instead of RS-232. Well, now you've got an IP-based system. What if that gets connected into your typical network? And now you're routable out to the internet. Well, so potentially you've got a backdoor that's waiting to happen there. The other aspect is, embedded logins and passwords. Just a few months ago, I think it was January this year, there was one of the major control system manufacturers actually found in their code that one of their programmers had put in a backdoor. and it had root level access to the control system, and it was embedded in the code, so they couldn't change the password. You actually had to load a firmware patch to get rid of that account. So there's all types of different vectors to attack a control system. Once you have a foothold in a control system, because it's connected to all of the devices in an audiovisual network, those are all soft targets. Audiovisual components, by and large, they don't have regular patches, and there's no automated mechanism to load those patches. So it's really incumbent on the systems administrator, the VTC operator, to maintain a patch level on those devices. And then we go back to the complication of, if you upgrade one component in that, chances are you're going to have to upgrade the control software that controls everything. So there's always this hesitance to load patches on an audiovisual integrated type system like that. Any questions here? So there are some mitigation factors when you talk about control systems. So, when you compromise a control system, you can essentially redirect feeds on a matrix switch to unintended destinations. You can gather IP information, outbound IP, establish outbound IP connections for further exploitation. And you can use control network to bridge between codecs of different classifications and try to exfiltrate data that way. So in the STIG, if you go through and implement a VTC, there's lineups in there, findings in there where you disable HTTP and only do HTTPS, right, for the web server. You disable all the unneeded services. You try to minimize the attack footprint on those codecs. Kind of hit or miss these days as far as how detailed those systems get audited, but those requirements are out there. The other aspect is actually a physical device. There are a couple solutions out on the market these days where you can install a device that will restrict communication between the control system and the codec itself. So it's essentially a data diode where it can receive certain commands, transmit those to the codec to execute certain things, and then the feedback is cut off. So it turns bidirectional communication between a control system and the codec to unidirectional. And so that'll reduce your risk footprint as far as any kind of compromise on a control system when it comes to communication with the codec. So there are those devices out there as well. In fact, when you're dealing with JWICs, DIA requires these devices be placed on the codec, between the codec and the control system, when you have a multi-domain VTC suite. Any questions here? No? All right, so periods processing, and this is one of my last few slides here, and we can open up for questions. So periods processing is the process by which you go through and sanitize a codec before you move it to a different classification. And let me pull it up here. I wanted to bring up the actual guidance because a lot of times in the audiovisual design world, if you can see that, let's see if I can, oh yeah, okay. So let me get to the page here. So essentially what you got to look for, it tells you all about the backgrounds, and then the multiple uses, and what type of information is actually classified. So here's the actual requirements, right, what you need to flush. So it has all the IP information, gatekeeper, endpoint IP address, DNS information. So all of the network type information is considered the classification of whatever network it sits on, right? So if you have a CIPRNet network and you have the IPs inside the codec, that's considered classified information, right? Classified up to secret. So there's two different approaches to periods processing. One is the automated approach, and there's a couple solutions out there depending on which classifications you want to switch between, and that's an automated process, right? The other aspect is you can actually do, in the bottom here, 1452, a manual periods processing procedure. And this is what I really wanted to hit on here, is the very first step. Disable local room controller from the codec. So a lot of times you'll see systems out there that were deployed, and all well-intentioned, I'm sure, but the control system itself was programmed as the periods processing device. And that's a huge risk because in that you have a shared memory space in the control system where some implementers are actually using to store IP information for all of the networks that codec is switching between. So now you have a device that's not necessarily doing periods processing, but what it is doing is changing the IP information on the codec and switching it. And that puts the environment at risk, because if that control system were compromised and that shared memory space, accessed, now they have information for all your IP networks, right? And you also, because it's never disconnected from the codec, potential, malicious firmware could be uploaded to that codec, where now they've enabled eavesdropping, right? Or an outbound IP connection to connect to a command and control server, whatever it is, so that's one of the key pieces here. And then you'll see it gets very complicated as far as what the manual procedure is. So you turn off all your fiber optic modems. You actually disconnect it from the network. That's what this step is here. And then you say no network. You have to configure your codec to no network, enable the web server, and then you connect a laptop computer to the RS-232 port of the codec. And then through that, that's where you end up going through and manually erasing all this data and then factory defaulting the codec. And then you can connect it to the new classification network, program the IP information, and that's done. That's the manual procedure. So, but key is, and that's one of the risks I would definitely highlight to all of you if you're operating a VTC suite, is make sure your control system's not being used to store IP information for all these different types of networks, because it is out there. Any questions about periods processing? I can certainly share all these documents with you. I have links at the end of the presentation here. Okay, so we're in the summary phase here. So you can see information solutions are enablers, but as capabilities increase, the complexity and the ability to secure them also increases exponentially. So it takes a lot of effort to secure these types of solutions. Security must be built in from day one. I hit this on the very first portion of this. If you're designing a system from the ground up, you need to look at all the aspects, because otherwise you're going to be in a situation where you're going to go through the DISA-STIG and you can't meet some of the criteria because the solution's not certified for your environment, or it just doesn't meet the technical specifications. And there's a multitude of other various certifications and requirements to offer product assurance. So make sure you understand all of them, and pick the ones that are correct for your environment. Don't just rely on one or two. Just make sure you look at the whole gamut of those rules and regulations and make sure that you're positioned well for it. All too often you have, the IT folks, buying these solutions and not really consulting with the SSO piece, right? So, and the SSO ultimately is responsible for the MSEC, the emissions security aspect of things. So, and ultimately, the SSO is certifying the room for processing classified information. So they need to buy off on whatever solutions you're deploying in that environment. I'm not trying to be all doomsday about security, but it is a balance, right? So you have to make sure your systems are secured, but you also have to make sure that they meet operational requirements. And so that's a balancing act that all of us struggle with on a day-to-day basis. So with that, are there any questions? Oh, an hour on the dot.
Is your briefing provided on the AFCEA website? Is there for the recordings of that?
I'm not sure. No one's asked, so I'll find out. I can always give you a copy.
Okay, Dan, thank you very much for your presentation.